I'm gonna be smart. I'm not gonna tell you my strategy.
Bernard Hopkins didn't just fight opponents, he psychologically destroyed them. They called him the executioner for good reason, but his most devastating weapon wasn't his jab or his defense. It was his mind, honed by 5 years in Graterford prison, where survival meant breaking other men before they broke you. Hopkins perfected the art of psychological warfare like no boxer before or since. He studied opponents' weaknesses, not just physical ones, but emotional scars, personal insecurities, and deepest fears. Then he weaponized that knowledge with surgical precision, turning press conferences into character assassinations and weigh-ins into public humiliations. We're talking about calculated cruelty that went far beyond trash talk. Hopkins crossed lines that other fighters wouldn't dare approach, attacking families, cultures, and personal traumas with zero remorse. His victims weren't just defeated, they were mentally shattered, their confidence destroyed before they ever stepped through the ropes. From racial controversies that divided nations to cultural attacks that sparked international incidents.
But it was a lie. There was nobody bigger.
Hopkins turned boxing into psychological warfare. These weren't professional disagreements. They were systematic campaigns designed to break human beings at their core. Today, we're counting down the 6 boxers that Bernard Hopkins despised most. The mental destruction you're about to witness will disturb you. This is boxing's cruelest mastermind unleashed. 6. William Jppy. Coming in at number 6 is the fighter who learned that talent means nothing against calculated psychological destruction. William "Fluffy" Jppy, the undefeated middleweight whose confidence was systematically dismantled before Hopkins ever threw a punch. Here's what went down during their build-up. Jppy entered their 2001 unification bout with an unblemished record and genuine belief he could outbox the crafty veteran. But sources close to both camps reveal Hopkins immediately identified Jppy's greatest weakness: his need for validation and respect from boxing's establishment. Hopkins began his psychological campaign by dismissing Jppy's amateur credentials, calling his Olympic experience meaningless against real professionals. During media sessions, Hopkins would interrupt Jppy's answers, talking over him and treating him like an inexperienced child. The mind games escalated when Hopkins started questioning Jppy's heart, suggesting he'd fold like a cheap suit when real pressure came. The breaking point came during their final press conference when Hopkins looked directly at Jppy and said, "You're not built for this level of competition. You're soft, and I'm going to expose you." Jppy, visibly rattled, tried defending his record, but Hopkins had already planted seeds of doubt that grew throughout training camp. Training insiders claim Jppy became obsessed with proving Hopkins wrong, changing his entire game plan to be more aggressive. Hopkins had successfully manipulated his opponent into abandoning everything that made him successful. When they finally fought, Jppy was already beaten mentally, fighting Hopkins' fight instead of his own. 5. Keith Holmes. Coming in at number 5 is the perfect record that Hopkins took personal pleasure in destroying. Keith "Wonderboy" Holmes, whose undefeated streak became the target of the most methodical psychological breakdown in middleweight history. Here's what went down during their preparation. Holmes entered their 2001 showdown with 38 straight victories and genuine confidence in his abilities. But camp sources reveal Hopkins viewed Holmes's pristine record as a personal insult, claiming undefeated fighters were protected prima donnas who'd never faced real adversity. Hopkins launched his mental assault by constantly referencing Holmes's lack of marquee victories, dismissing his record as padded with tomato cans and has-beens. During sparring sessions at the same gym, Hopkins would deliberately time his workouts to coincide with Holmes's, creating an intimidating presence that disrupted his opponent's routine. The psychological warfare intensified when Hopkins began targeting Holmes's self-image as a slick boxer. "You think you're slick, but you've never faced anyone who could think," Hopkins told reporters. "I'm going to take away everything you think you know about boxing." He questioned Holmes's chin, his heart, and most devastatingly, his intelligence. Training camp insiders reveal Holmes became increasingly paranoid about Hopkins' game plan, spending countless hours studying tape instead of perfecting his own skills. Hopkins had successfully gotten inside his head, making Holmes doubt his natural abilities. When they met in the ring, Holmes looked tentative and uncertain, second-guessing every movement. Hopkins had achieved his goal, turning a confident, undefeated champion into a hesitant fighter afraid of making mistakes. 4. Oscar De La Hoya. Coming in at number 4 is the golden boy who discovered that privilege couldn't protect him from street-level psychological warfare. Oscar Golden Boy De La Hoya, whose mainstream success became Hopkins' primary target in a class war that divided boxing. Here's what went down behind the scenes. De La Hoya represented everything Hopkins resented about boxing: Olympic gold medals, mainstream media love, and corporate backing. Camp sources reveal Hopkins viewed their 2004 encounter as more than a title fight. It was a chance to expose the difference between real fighters and manufactured stars. Hopkins began his campaign by attacking De La Hoya's authenticity, questioning his Mexican heritage and calling him a fake Mexican who forgot where he came from. The psychological assault escalated when Hopkins targeted De La Hoya's business ventures, dismissing him as a part-time fighter more interested in photo shoots than real competition. The mind games reached personal levels when Hopkins questioned De La Hoya's dedication to boxing, suggesting his various interests proved he didn't have the heart of a real champion. During press conferences, Hopkins would mock De La Hoya's Hollywood connections, calling him pretty boy boxing for pretty boy fans. Training insiders claim Hopkins studied De La Hoya's previous losses, specifically targeting his tendency to wilt under pressure from aggressive fighters. Hopkins promised to bring street fighting to his pampered world and show him what real Philadelphia boxing looked like. The psychological warfare worked perfectly. De La Hoya entered the ring looking tight and uncomfortable, fighting Hopkins' gritty style instead of utilizing his natural boxing skills. Hopkins had successfully dragged the Golden Boy into the gutter where he thrived. 3. Roy Jones Jr. Coming in at number 3 is the pound-for-pound king who Hopkins systematically exposed as an overrated fraud. Roy Superman Jones Jr., whose athletic superiority couldn't overcome the mental warfare of a true boxing psychopath. Here's what went down during their extended rivalry. Jones had dominated Hopkins years earlier, but their 2010 rematch represented Hopkins' chance for ultimate psychological revenge. Sources reveal Hopkins spent years studying Jones's decline, identifying his greatest weakness, an ego that couldn't accept aging. Hopkins launched his mental campaign by constantly referencing Jones's diminished reflexes, calling him a shot fighter living off past glory. The psychological assault intensified when Hopkins began questioning Jones's choice of recent opponents, dismissing them as carefully selected victims to protect his reputation. The mind games became deeply personal when Hopkins attacked Jones's legacy, claiming his best victories came against overmatched middleweights and blown-up welterweights. Hopkins promised to expose him as the fraud he'd always been and show the world that speed without heart means nothing. Training camp insiders reveal Hopkins studied every aspect of Jones's mental state, noting his defensive posture during interviews and decreased confidence in his abilities. Hopkins deliberately scheduled media appearances to coincide with Jones's, creating uncomfortable face-to-face encounters that heightened tension. The psychological warfare culminated when Hopkins openly mocked Jones's attempts to recapture past glory, calling him desperate and pathetic. When they finally fought, Jones looked every bit the faded champion Hopkins had painted him as, tentative and uncertain about his own abilities. 2. Felix Trinidad. Coming in at number 2 is the cultural warfare that shocked the boxing world. Felix Tito Trinidad, whose Puerto Rican pride became the target of Hopkins' most ruthless and controversial psychological campaign. Here's what went down during their bitter buildup. Trinidad represented everything Hopkins despised about modern boxing: flash over substance, style over heart. But sources reveal Hopkins' true target wasn't Trinidad's boxing. It was his cultural identity and family values that Hopkins systematically attacked. Hopkins began his assault by questioning Puerto Rican boxing tradition, dismissing the island's fighters as overrated pretty boys who couldn't handle real American competition. The psychological warfare escalated when Hopkins made deliberately inflammatory comments about Puerto Rican culture, calling their boxing style soft and their fighters mentally weak. The campaign reached disturbing levels when Hopkins targeted Trinidad's family, making inappropriate comments about his father's role as trainer and questioning his son's manhood. During press conferences, Hopkins would speak directly to Trinidad's father in broken Spanish, showing calculated disrespect for their relationship. Training insiders reveal Hopkins had researched Trinidad's background extensively, identifying his deep connection to family and cultural pride as exploitable weaknesses. Hopkins promised to send him back to the island crying to his daddy, and claimed Puerto Ricans were too emotional to handle real pressure. The psychological destruction was complete when Hopkins attacked Trinidad's identity as a man, making disturbing suggestions about his character and courage. When they fought, Trinidad looked emotionally shattered, unable to focus on boxing while carrying the weight of Hopkins' cultural attacks and family insults. 1. Joe Kalzagi. Coming in at number 1 is the most controversial and racially charged feud in Hopkins' career. Joe, Pride of Wales Kalzagi, whose European background became the target of psychological warfare that crossed every line of human decency. Hopkins began by dismissing Kalzagi's undefeated record as manufactured in a weak European division against inferior opposition. The psychological assault escalated when Hopkins made racially inflammatory comments, suggesting European fighters lacked the natural fighting instincts of American boxers. The warfare reached shocking levels when Hopkins made explicitly racial comments about Kalzagi's athletic ability, using coded language that boxing insiders immediately recognized as crossing fundamental lines. Hopkins promised to show him what real athletic ability looked like, and claimed Kalzagi had never faced anyone with real natural gifts. Training camp sources reveal Hopkins had studied Kalzagi's perceived weaknesses extensively, targeting his relative inexperience against elite American competition. But the psychological campaign became deeply personal when Hopkins questioned Kalzagi's worthiness as an opponent, suggesting age and race would determine the outcome. The controversy exploded when Hopkins' comments sparked international incidents, with European media condemning his rhetoric as inappropriate and dangerous. When they finally fought, the psychological warfare had poisoned the entire event, turning what should have been a celebration of boxing into a referendum on Hopkins' character and methods. Bernard Hopkins' mind was his deadliest weapon, capable of destroying opponents before they ever entered the ring. These psychological campaigns proved that mental warfare could be more devastating than any physical punch. Which psychological attack was the most brutal? Smash that like button, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more boxing's darkest stories.